your feet. Now." The voice cut through courtroom B9 like a blade, finding the gap between ribs. Sharp practice designed to produce immediate obedience, and it had never once failed to do exactly that until this particular Tuesday morning in Charleston County Family Court, when the woman in the titanium wheelchair did not move a single muscle. Officer Ray Stuckey, badge number 4, 4'16" feet, 220 pounds of courthouse authority, stepped away from the wall where he had been stationed and walked with deliberate, unhurried confidence toward the woman sitting at the respondent's table, or rather beside it, because the table's chairs were bolted to the floor and there had been no room made for her, so she had positioned her wheelchair in the aisle where it half blocked the path to the exit, and nobody had bothered to fix that either. The fluorescent light overhead caught the titanium frame of her chair and threw a pale silver gleam across the linoleum, and the woman's hands, brown-skinned, steady. The hands of someone who had learned long ago that stillness was its own kind of power, rested flat on the armrests without trembling. Stuckey stopped 6 inches from her left wheel. The whole room had gone quiet the way rooms go quiet when something is about to happen that everyone can feel, but nobody wants to be the one to name. At the elevated bench, Judge Dina Hartwell, platinum blonde hair swept into a coil so precise it looked architectural gold-rimmed reading glasses, sitting on the bridge of her nose, like a crown, looked down at the woman who had not stood, and something moved behind her eyes that was not quite confusion and not quite respect, but was absolutely the beginning of anger. Ma'am Stuckey said again, lower this time, leaning in close enough that she could smell the burnt coffee on his breath. "This court requires all persons to rise when the judge enters. That means you." The woman looked up, not at Stuckey past him, straight up at Judge Hartwell, the way you look at the thing that actually has power over you, the way you have learned to look at danger directly and without flinching, because looking away has never once made danger smaller. "The last time someone ordered me to stand," she said, and her voice was as flat and as final as poured concrete. "I was lying in a field hospital in Afghanistan with shrapnel in my spine. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. In the back row, a woman in a gray blazer, the only person in the room who had been writing in her notebook before any of this happened, pressed her pen harder against the paper and began moving it very, very fast. Nobody in courtroom B9 that morning knew yet what Nadia Okafor had done in the Helmand province in 2013, or how many people were alive because of her, or how much it had cost her to keep them that way. They were about to find out, and by the time they did, nothing about this custody hearing or this courthouse would ever be quite the same again. The alarm was set for 5:50, but Nadia Okafor had been awake since 5:47, lying in the gray pre-dawn stillness of her bedroom on Caldwell Street with her eyes open and her hands folded across her chest, watching the ceiling the way soldiers watch the horizon, not expecting something specific, just refusing to be surprised. She transferred from the bed to the wheelchair in 4 practiced movements, the kind of economy that comes not from limitation, but from having done something so many thousands of times that the body stops needing to think about it and just executes. And by 6:02, she was in the kitchen with coffee brewing and the day already organized in her mind like a tactical brief. The house was clean, in a way that most people's houses were not. Not sterile, not cold, but precise. The way things are arranged when the person living in them has spent decades in environments where disorder was a form of danger, where a misplaced instrument or a mislabeled supply could mean someone didn't make it home. Towels folded in thirds and then thirds again. Corners aligned. The 3 pairs of shoes by the front door arranged heel to heel, toe to toe, even though she only wore 1 pair anymore and had worn only 1 pair for 11 years. On the shelf beside the window in the morning light that came in gold and thin and without apology, 2 photographs stood side by side. The larger one showed a young woman in her late 20s laughing at something outside the frame, her face so alive with it that the photograph almost seemed to move Imani. Her daughter taken 2 summers before the accident, before the phone call on a Tuesday evening that had rearranged the entire architecture of the world. Beside it, in a smaller frame, an 8-year-old girl with a gap-toothed grin held up a crayon drawing for the camera. A house with far too many windows, every single one of them yellow with the light that children draw when they want to show a place is warm. Lily. Nadia looked at that drawing for a moment, at the impractical abundance of windows, at the cheerful disorder of a child's vision of home, and then she opened the kitchen drawer and took out the original, the actual crayon drawing that had arrived in an envelope 3 weeks ago through the social worker's office, and she folded it carefully and placed it in the breast pocket of her jacket over her heart, where it would stay for the duration of everything that was about to happen. The coffee was ready. She poured it, drank it standing, or rather sitting, but with the posture of someone standing, and watched the cardinals come to the bird bath in the backyard, red against the gray morning, impossibly vivid, going about the business of being alive with the complete indifference to difficulty that only birds and small children ever manage to sustain. At 6:12, the phone rang. Nadia. It was Adrian Webb, her attorney, and something in the single syllable of her name told her, before he said another word, that the news was not good, because Adrian had been practicing family law for 22 years and had developed the particular vocal quality of a man who has had to deliver difficult information so many times that he now does it with his whole chest leaning into it, the way you lean into a headwind when you know you can't stop walking. We have a problem. Trevor's attorney filed supplemental materials last night. They're arguing you're physically unfit to care for a child. Physically unfit. The words sat in her chest the way shrapnel sits, not the dramatic, explosive kind of pain, but the slow, deep kind that you learn to breathe around, because the alternative is not breathing at all. And Nadia had learned years ago that there were certain phrases the world kept finding new ways to say to her, and not enough was just the latest arrangement of a very old song. She let the silence ask the question. The evaluation Dr. Kessler submitted. Adrian continued focuses on what you can't do physically rather than what you've demonstrated you can do. They're building the argument around Lily being 8 years old and active, and the implication is that a woman in a wheelchair cannot keep up with the demands of a healthy child. A pause. Nadia, there's something else. I've heard things about Judge Hartwell. Complaints filed, D. Compliance issues, disability access issues, all dismissed, but the pattern is there. Pattern. She stored that word away and let it sit beside the other things she was storing. Trevor Boland was 42 years old and had been Imani's husband for 3 years, before Imani had the courage and the clarity to leave him, and 8 months after Imani filed the paperwork, she had died in a collision on I-26 on a Wednesday morning in November, and Trevor had appeared at the funeral with red eyes and a grief so performative that Nadia had wanted to say something and had said nothing because the occasion demanded dignity. She had understood within 2 weeks of the funeral what Trevor actually wanted, because Trevor had never loved Lily, not the way you love a child, not the way you love something fragile and irreplaceable and entirely dependent on you for its sense of the world. But Lily came attached to Imani's life insurance, to the house Imani had bought before the marriage in her own name, to monthly benefits that would continue until the child turned 18, and Trevor Boland had looked at a grieving 8-year-old girl and done arithmetic. Don't let him take her, Mama. Those had been Imani's words spoken on the phone 6 months before she died, her voice low and certain in the particular way of someone who knows what they know and needs someone else to hold the knowledge for safekeeping. Promise me. When is the hearing? Nadia asked. Tuesday, 9 a.m. Judge Dina Hartwell presiding. I'll be there. She ended the call, finished her coffee, and began to prepare for war. Nadia arrived 45 minutes early, which was to say she arrived at the time that other people would have called early, but that she simply called arriving because in 23 years of military service, she had internalized at a cellular level the understanding that being on time means being late, and that any environment worth navigating rewards the person who arrives before the environment has had time to arrange itself against you. The accessible entrance on the side of the building had a buzzer. The buzzer required someone inside to answer. The someone inside took 4 minutes and 51 seconds to respond, which Nadia counted the way she had always counted things, not out of anxiety, but out of habit, because numbers were reliable in a way that most things were not. The security officer at the door spoke slowly and loudly, as people sometimes did when confronted with a wheelchair, as though the chair were evidence of a general impairment rather than a specific one. Nadia answered his questions in her normal voice, which was unhurried and precise, and when he asked her to raise her arms for the scanner, she explained without apology or performance that her left arm could not clear shoulder height due to a rotator cuff injury documented at the VA hospital, and she offered the case number, and the officer blinked and waved her through. The elevator to the second floor carried a sign that said temporarily out of service in letters that had been printed on paper that had since yellowed and curled at the edges and been retaped with tape that was itself beginning to yellow, which suggested a definition of temporarily that was doing a great deal of work. Nadia looked at the staircase. 14 steps, metal railing on the right side. She folded the chair, gripped the railing with her right hand, and went up 1 step at a time, pulling the folded chair behind her, with her left hand, her shoulders burning her jaw. Set 3 minutes and 18 seconds from bottom to top, and when she reached the landing, she unfolded the chair, transferred back into it, sat up straight, and continued toward the clerk's window as though she had taken an elevator. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the nameplate reading Elliot Crane, looked at her over the rim of his computer screen and asked for documentation confirming her disability. Nadia looked at the chair, then at Crane, then back at the chair. "The chair isn't official enough," she said. "Policy requires documentation, ma'am." She pulled out her phone, found the VA letter, held it to the glass. Crane squinted at it without reading and informed her that he needed a physical copy. Nadia went to the law library third-floor elevator, still broken, printed 3 copies returned, gave Crane 1 filed, 1 in her bag in the folder she kept labeled backup, and photographed the clerk's stamp and signature before he had finished pressing it. "That's not necessary," Crane said. "I'll decide what's necessary," Nadia said, and she said it in the same tone she had used to say it in field hospitals in 2 countries. The tone that was not rude, but was not negotiable, and she moved away from the window toward the courtroom at the end of the hall. Outside the double doors, Cassandra Vale was waiting, platinum hair pulled into a knot so geometrically precise it looked less like a hairstyle and more like an architectural decision, a silk blouse the color of winter light heels that struck the tile with the rhythmic authority of someone who had learned to use the sound of her own footsteps as a form of argument. She looked down at Nadia from the height advantage her heels provided, and the angle of her gaze was calculated the way all of Cassandra Vale's angles were calculated, and she smiled. "Mrs. Okafor," she said, "I hope you're prepared. This won't be pleasant." "It's Ms.," Nadia said, "and I've had worse mornings." She wheeled past without looking back, and the double doors swung open before her, and the room that had not been built for her waited inside. Courtroom B9 held 20 rows of wooden pews, half of them empty on this Tuesday morning, an American flag in the corner that leaned approximately 4 degrees from vertical, as though it too had grown tired of trying, and a judge's bench elevated on a platform reached by 2 wide steps. No ramp. No accommodation. The kind of architectural assumption that says we built this for a certain kind of person, and did not particularly consider the other kinds. The respondent's table had 4 chairs bolted to the floor. There was no space left for a wheelchair without removing one of the bolted chairs, which no one had done, so Nadia positioned herself at the end of the table in the aisle partially blocking the fire exit route, which was not ideal and was not safe, but was the only option that had been left available to her, and she had called Adrian about it twice, and Adrian had called the court about it twice, and here they were. Trevor Boland sat across the aisle at the petitioner's table with the particular ease of a man who had spent money on a lawyer and consequently believed the money had already done most of the difficult work. He was the kind of tan that came from a facility rather than the outdoors, wearing a polo shirt pressed with institutional precision. And when he looked at Nadia, it was with the specific expression of someone who has decided in advance how a story ends and is merely waiting for the formality of the pages turning. Cassandra Vale sat beside him, arranging her materials with the methodical care of a surgeon laying out instruments. At 7:30 exactly, the side door opened, and Judge Dina Hartwell swept into the room. Blonde hair caught the overhead light as she settled behind the elevated bench, adjusted her robe, and looked out over the courtroom with the detached authority of 15 years on the bench, the kind of authority that had stopped bothering to justify itself. "All rise," said Officer Stuckey from his position near the wall, and every person in courtroom B9 rose. Every person except the woman in the titanium wheelchair at the respondent's table, whose hands remained flat on the armrests, whose expression did not change, and who was looking not at the officer but directly, steadily at the judge. The sequence of events that followed happened in the slow-motion way that significant moments sometimes do, each second stretching slightly beyond its natural length as though time itself were leaning in to make sure it didn't miss anything. Stuckey's first command. Nadia's stillness. Hartwell's voice from the bench carrying the weight of 15 years and a complete confidence that she had never yet said something in this room that was not immediately obeyed. "Ma'am, this court requires all persons to rise." Adrian stepping forward to speak and being cut off. Nadia pulling out her phone, methodical, unhurried to cite the Americans with Disabilities Act Title II. Section 35.130, which she had memorized not recently but some time ago, because Nadia Okafor had learned in places considerably more dangerous than a family courtroom, that the most important preparation you can do is learn exactly what rights you have before the moment arrives when someone tries to take them. Hartwell's gavel came down once hard, the sound of it ringing through the half-empty room like a starting pistol. "This is my courtroom, Miss Okafor. Federal guidelines do not override judicial discretion in matters of decorum. When I enter this room, everyone rises." "Are we clear? I'm documenting this exchange for the record," Nadia said. "You are documenting nothing. Bailiff, confiscate that phone." Stuckey moved toward her, hand extended. And here in this small charged moment, something happened that nobody in the room noticed except Nadia, because Nadia had spent 2 decades reading the micro-expressions of people under extreme pressure. Stuckey hesitated. Not for long, not visibly. Not in any way that would register to a casual observer. But there was a half-second where his extended hand did not move forward and his eyes moved sideways, and something in him that was not quite conscience and not quite doubt passed through his face like a cloud crossing the sun. And then it was gone, and he stepped forward again. Nadia lowered the phone to the table face down and pressed record. "One more disruption," Hartwell said, "and I will hold you in contempt." "Understood," Nadia said in the tone of someone who understands a great deal more than is being said. The hearing opened, and in the back row, Donna Reyes, gray blazer, dark eyes, 7 months of notes in a black notebook, wrote without stopping. Vale rose to present her opening argument with the smooth, collected energy of someone who had rehearsed this particular performance until it no longer felt like performance but had become a kind of truth, which was, Nadia had always thought the most dangerous kind of lie. "Your Honor," Vale began, and her voice had the quality of expensive things, deliberate, controlled, leaving nothing to chance. This case is at its foundation simple. A child needs stability. A child needs a present active guardian who can meet her needs fully physically and emotionally on every ordinary day and on every difficult one. She paused in the precisely calculated way she had paused in many courtrooms before this one, and the pause did exactly what it was designed to do. which was to create a space in which the next sentence landed harder than it otherwise would have. My client, Trevor Boland, offers that stability. He offers a home, a future, and an active presence in the life of a child who has already lost too much. She turned to look at Nadia, then not with cruelty, which would have been too obvious, but with something that masqueraded as concern, which was worse. The respondent, Ms. Okafor, is a woman of evident determination, but determination is not the same as capability, and this court must weigh not what Ms. Okafor wishes she could provide, but what the evidence demonstrates she actually can. She sat down. The room absorbed the argument the way dry ground absorbs water quickly without visible resistance. Adrian rose, and his presentation was slower, heavier, the way honest things sometimes are, when placed beside polished ones. He talked about Lily's school records, attendance perfect for 2 years, grades strong, behavioral notes, uniformly positive, a child who arrived every morning at 7:45 with her homework done and her shoes tied because her grandmother had brought her every single morning without exception. He talked about the home Nadia had made, the routines, the stability that was real rather than promised. He tried to raise the restraining order Imani had filed against Trevor Boland 14 months before her death. Vale was on her feet before the sentence was complete. Hartwell sustained the objection without deliberation, without even the performance of consideration. Just the gavel. Just the word sustained, quick and clean, like a door being shut on a room you were not meant to see into. The first witness Vale called was a neighbor of Trevor's who had known him for 18 months and described him as a patient, devoted man who had spoken of nothing but getting back to Lily since the day Imani died. Adrian's cross-examination was brief and precise. The witness confirmed without particular emotion that he had moved onto Trevor's street after Imani filed the restraining order and therefore had no knowledge of the circumstances that had made her feel the need to file it. Small victories. The room gave them nothing. Vale's second witness was Dr. Warren Kessler, a court-appointed psychologist of the particular type who has discovered that the most reliable income stream in family law is the willingness to provide professional-sounding conclusions that align with what the contracting party needs them to say, and who had developed over many years of practice a precise and versatile vocabulary for doing so. He took the stand with the practiced gravity of expertise, consulting his notes with the careful deliberation of a man who wants you to understand that there is a great deal of information here and that he is distilling it responsibly. I found that Mr. Boland presents as a stable, emotionally available individual, Kessler said with appropriate parenting instincts and a genuine desire to provide a structured environment for the child. And Ms. Okafor Vale asked. Kessler paused, and the pause was the particular kind that signals bad news delivered regretfully rather than bad news delivered willingly, though the effect is identical. Ms. Okafor is clearly capable. In many respects, he said carefully, in the way one discusses a patient who has a terminal diagnosis and has not yet been informed. However, during our evaluation, I noted that her emotional affect was flat detached, which can indicate difficulty with emotional connection with the kind of present responsive bonding that a young child requires. Flat, detached. Nadia sat with those words the way you sit with a medical diagnosis you saw coming from 3 appointments away, the way you absorb something that is both entirely wrong and entirely impossible to quickly disprove, because the truth that flat and detached was what 23 years of seeing things nobody should have to see had left on the surface of a person who had survived them, that it was a scar and not a symptom, that beneath it was more feeling than Kessler had accumulated in his entire comfortable career was not the kind of truth that could be explained to a man who had spent 20 minutes with her and had already written his conclusion before he arrived. Adrian's cross-examination was methodical and damaging in the best way cross-examinations can be, which is to say it did not change the testimony, but it changed the room's relationship to it. He established that Kessler had spent 20 minutes with Nadia and 75 with Trevor, that his evaluation had been requested and paid for by the petitioner's legal team, and that his previous 12 court appearances in family law cases had resulted in 11 recommendations that aligned with the hiring party's preferred outcome. Hartwell overruled every one of Adrian's objections with the same brisk efficiency she had sustained Vale's, the gavel coming down with the regularity of a clock that knew what time it wanted it to be. At 11:45, Hartwell called a lunch recess, and then, with the lightness of someone mentioning that the weather might change, added that tomorrow's session would begin at 8 a.m. instead of 9. Nadia wrote it down without expression. She had already started counting. The side exit from the second floor led to a small concrete courtyard that appeared to have been designed as an afterthought and maintained as an apology. A single tree that had given up trying stood in one corner, 3 concrete benches occupied the rest of the space, and the whole area received the particular quality of midday light that makes institutional buildings look most like what they are, which is structures designed for function and indifferent to comfort. Nadia wheeled out into the thin November sun, and she stopped and closed her eyes and let herself do something she rarely permitted in front of other people, which was to feel the accumulated weight of the morning. In the dark behind her eyelids, not a full memory, but its residue, the smell of burning fuel and burned earth on a hillside in Helmand Province, the way a person's breathing changes in the seconds before they lose consciousness. The warmth of a hand she had been holding when she stopped being able to feel her own legs. A young man's voice saying something she could not now hear clearly, but which had sounded at the time like the most important thing anyone had ever said. And then silence. She let it sit there the way you let grief sit, not fighting it, not following it, just acknowledging that it was real and that it was hers, and that she would carry it because that was what she had always done. Then she opened her eyes, and the courtyard was there, and the November sun was there, and a woman in a gray blazer was walking toward her with the careful approach of someone who has learned not to startle wounded animals. "Ms. Okafor," the woman said, stopping a respectful distance from the chair. "I'm Donna Reyes, Charleston Post and Courier, investigative desk. I've been covering court access issues for 7 months." She paused. "I saw what happened in there this morning." "You saw a judge do her job," Nadia said. "I saw a judge order a disabled black woman to stand up, threaten her with contempt when she cited federal law, and try to confiscate her phone." Donna's voice was quiet and even and not unkind. "I've seen Hartwell do versions of this before. I have 19 complaints going back 6 years, all involving people with disabilities, most of them people of color, all of the complaints dismissed." She paused again. "All of them." Something sharpened in Nadia's expression. Not surprise, because she had suspected something like this from the first moment she had watched Hartwell sustain Vale's objections, with the ease of a woman doing something she had done many times before. But something like confirmation, the particular relief of having a suspicion converted into information. "Why are you telling me this?" Nadia asked. "Because you didn't flinch," Donna said. "Because everyone else I've documented did. They were too scared, too tired, too beaten down by the time they got in front of her to hold their ground. But you did." She pulled a business card from her jacket pocket and placed it on the arm of the wheelchair without presuming to put it in Nadia's hand. "I'm not asking for anything right now, but if something happens in there, if she crosses a line, I want you to have my number." Nadia looked at the card for a moment, then picked it up and placed it in her pocket beside the folded crayon drawing of the house with too many windows. The afternoon session began at 1:15 with Vale calling Nadia to the witness stand, and the stand, as with most of the physical infrastructure of courtroom B9, had not been modified to accommodate a wheelchair, which meant that Nadia had to angle herself sideways into the space beside the box, while Stuckey stood near the wall and watched and did not offer to help. And she did this without comment or hesitation, with the efficiency of someone who has learned that the environment will very rarely arrange itself for you, and that the faster you stop waiting for it to do so, the more energy you have available for everything else. Vale's examination was structured around a slow, methodical dismantling of the image of Nadia as a capable guardian built one question at a time. Each question seemingly reasonable, each one laying another brick in a wall whose purpose was to enclose and diminish. Can you dress yourself? Yes. Can you cook? Yes. Can you drive? Modified vehicle. Hand controls. Can you run? Vale asked, and Adrian was already on his feet, and Hartwell was already sustaining the relevance of the question before he finished the objection, and Vale turned back to Nadia with the patient expression of someone waiting for a door to open. No, Nadia said. I'm paralyzed from the waist down, as you already know. Vale constructed a scenario. Then a child running toward a busy street, a moment of emergency requiring immediate physical response, and asked Nadia to explain how she would handle it, and Nadia's answer was not defensive, not emotional, not the answer of someone overwhelmed by the question, but rather the answer of a person who had spent more than 2 decades making exactly these calculations in real time under circumstances in which the margin for error was a human life. She described what she would do, the voice command, the emergency brake, the phone in her hand, before most people would have processed that something was wrong. The strategic positioning she had already calculated every time she took Lily anywhere, the habit of assessment that had never once left her because you don't unlearn the instincts that kept people alive, you just find new applications for them. I've kept soldiers alive in worse conditions than a crosswalk, she said, and the moment the word soldiers left her mouth, she knew it had landed differently than she intended, and she watched Vale's eyes light up with the particular brightness of a person who has just been handed a key. Soldiers, Vale repeated, turning to the bench. Ms. Okafor is claiming military experience, Your Honor. I'd like to explore this for purposes of credibility. Hartwell leaned forward with an expression of interest that Nadia read immediately as not genuine curiosity but performed open-mindedness, the kind that precedes a trap, and she allowed the question and Nadia answered honestly because she had never in her life found dishonesty to be more efficient than the truth in the long run. 23 years, she said, Army Medical Corps. The examination continued, Vale pressing on each limitation with the precision of someone finding a bruise and returning to it, and Nadia answered each question with the same level steadiness, not rising, not retreating, just present until the final question, which was whether her body could handle the demands of parenting a 7-year-old child. And Nadia looked at Vale, and then looked at Hartwell, and then looked at Trevor Boland sitting at the other table with his smug and settled certainty, and she said what was true. I have carried soldiers through gunfire and performed surgery in a tent with mortars falling 200 meters outside, she said, and her voice carried in the way that voices carry when the person speaking them has stood in rooms where volume was a survival skill so that even the people in the back rows heard every syllable. I have held dying men in my arms and kept them alive through sheer force of will from every position and in every condition. My body handles what my mind demands. It always has. It always will. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and that everyone present knows they will remember. Vale said no further questions and sat down. The session adjourned at 5:30, and the courthouse emptied with the efficient relief of people who have spent a day inside a building performing difficult things and are ready to stop. And by 5:45, the hallway outside courtroom B9 held almost nobody. Just the echo of footsteps already gone, and the particular silence of a building that has seen too many painful days to be moved by one more. Nadia was wheeling toward the staircase. The elevator remained non-functional, the temporary sign still yellowing, the tape still surrendering when Trevor Boland stepped into the center of the hallway in front of her. He had the posture of a man who has calculated that the absence of witnesses is a kind of permission, and he stood with his weight distributed in the specific way of someone who has rehearsed this moment and is now executing it. and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who has mistaken his target. He said things designed to land where they would hurt most Imani's name, used like an instrument. The word broken applied to the chair to Nadia herself, to the idea that someone in her position could give a child anything worth having. His voice stayed low and controlled, the way the voices of men who have practice, staying controlled in these particular kinds of moments, always stay low and controlled right up until they don't. He reached out and grabbed the handle of her wheelchair. Nadia counted to 3 in her head, which was approximately 2.5 seconds, and when she reached 3, she brought her left hand up with the economic precision of someone who has spent 23 years studying the architecture of the human body and knows exactly where it is most persuadable, and she struck the bundle of tendons at the inside of his wrist at the precise angle that causes the hand to release involuntarily, and Trevor's grip spasmed open, and his expression shifted in rapid succession from shock to pain to something that looked briefly and involuntarily like fear. She put distance between them with 2 backward rotations of her wheels. "I know every pressure point and every nerve cluster in the human body," she said, her voice the same as it had been on the witness stand, even unhurried final. "You touch me again, you'll learn all of them personally." Trevor cradled his wrist, looked at her, and said, his voice cracking slightly at the edges, "This isn't over." "No," Nadia agreed. "It isn't." She turned toward the stairs and began the process of going down them one at a time, the way she had come up, and in the pocket of her jacket. The phone was still recording, and at the far end of the hallway, Officer Stuckey stood and watched the whole thing with his hands at his sides, and did not look away. The house on Caldwell Street was the kind of quiet at 8 p.m. that is not peaceful, but is merely the absence of noise. The kind of quiet that has too much room in it for the thoughts you spent the day keeping busy enough not to think. And Nadia sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread across it. The VA letter. The accommodation request with Crane's stamp photographed at 3 angles. The notes she had taken during the hearing in the small, precise handwriting of someone trained to record exactly what happened, rather than impressions of what happened, and she worked. Adrian's text arrived at 8:17. Trevor's attorney filed a motion for expedited ruling. Hartwell granted it. "Closing arguments tomorrow. Decision by end of day." She read it twice. Then she set the phone down and looked at the wall. End of day. That meant she had less than 24 hours. At 8:45, a second notification came, an automated call from Charleston County Family Court. A woman's recorded voice informing her that her hearing tomorrow had been moved from 8 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. and to please confirm receipt. Nadia confirmed. Less than 12 hours' notice, no written documentation. The second time in 24 hours, the schedule had been changed in the direction that would most inconvenience someone who lived 40 minutes from the courthouse and needed accessible transportation to get there. She looked at the photograph of Imani on the shelf, the laughing, living photograph, the one that still made the room feel occupied even when Nadia was in it alone. And then she opened her laptop and typed Cassandra Vale, Attorney, Charleston, into the search bar, and the results loaded a LinkedIn profile, a law firm bio, a State Bar Association listing, and a photograph she almost scrolled past. It was from a legal fundraising gala 3 years ago, captioned with both names in the caption text, Attorney Cassandra Vale and the Honorable Judge Dina Hartwell standing together in formal attire. Champagne glasses held at the same height, the comfortable ease of 2 people who did not need to introduce themselves because they had never needed an introduction. Nadia screenshotted the image, saved it to 3 separate locations, and sent it to Adrian with a subject line that read, "Found it." Her phone rang 40 seconds later. "Where did you get this?" Adrian asked. "The internet," Nadia said. "Took 20 minutes. A silence. Then, "This is grounds for recusal. A personal relationship between the presiding judge and opposing counsel undisclosed to the respondent." "File the motion first thing in the morning," Nadia said. And I have something else for you. Come by at 7. I'll show you. The weekly video call was supervised 30 minutes, a social worker named Patricia, visible in the corner of the screen, the particular quality of a permitted thing rather than a natural one. But Lily didn't seem to notice the supervision, or perhaps she had already learned at 8 years old to exist within constraints without making them the dominant fact of the moment, which was a skill Nadia recognized because she had learned it herself at a much higher cost. Lily's face appeared on the screen and immediately rearranged itself into the gap-toothed grin that had been making Nadia feel ever since Lily was 4 years old that the world was more survivable than it sometimes seemed. "Ba oi, Grandma, look!" She held up a drawing, the same house she always drew with the same abundance of windows that had always made Nadia think the child's vision of home was a place so full of light it had run out of wall space. But this time there was something new beside the front door. A small figure in what was unmistakably a wheelchair, rendered in black crayon with the bold confidence of someone who considers this detail important and not sad. They talked about school, about the gray cat named Mittens at the foster placement, about Saturday pancakes that were okay but not as good as Grandma's, and then Lily's voice shifted just a fraction, the slight flattening of a child who is reporting something they have been told and are not sure how to carry. "Trevor came to visit yesterday," Lily said. "He brought me a doll. He said, when I come live with him, I won't have to visit your house anymore." A pause. "He said your house is sad." Nadia looked around the kitchen, the photograph of Imani, the 2 places set at the table out of habit, the bird feeder visible through the window. The glow she knew was coming from Lily's room, where the stars on the ceiling were already beginning to shine in the early dark. "Your house is sad," Lily repeated in the uncertain tone of a child transmitting a message they don't understand. Why would it be sad? Grandma Nadia was quiet for a moment, and the moment held everything. The 2 years since Imani, the accumulated weight of all the mornings, the particular grief of a photograph that used to move, and now only stood still. "Our house isn't sad," she said finally, and her voice was as steady as it had been in the courtroom, maybe steadier. "Our house is waiting for you to come home." Patricia made the gesture that meant time. Lily waved with both hands the way small children wave when they mean it with their whole bodies. After the call ended, Nadia sat in the silence of the kitchen for 3 minutes without moving, and then she put her hand in her breast pocket and felt the folded edge of the crayon drawing, and she got back to work. At 6:15 a.m., more than an hour before the rescheduled hearing, courtroom B9 was dark and empty and smelled of old wood and the particular staleness of a room that holds difficult conversations and is never fully aired out. And Nadia sat in the aisle beside the respondent's table in the dark and waited with the stillness of someone who has learned that waiting is not the same as weakness. The security officer at the entrance had nodded at her this morning without the performance of yesterday. A small mercy, the kind that comes when a person decides that yesterday's treatment was more trouble than it was worth, and the staircase had taken 3 minutes and 12 seconds, which was 6 seconds faster than yesterday, because some things improve with repetition whether you want them to or not. She heard Vale's heels before she saw her, the architectural click of them in the empty corridor outside, and then the double doors swung open, and Vale stepped into the darkened courtroom, and stopped when she saw Nadia already there, her expression cycling through surprise before settling back into its habitual composure. Ms. Okafor Vale said. Counselor Nadia said. Adrian arrived at 7:15, breathless, his coat still buttoned wrong, and when he saw Nadia, he exhaled the specific relief of a man who had been quietly terrified she would miss the rescheduled time. "I just got the voicemail," he said. 7:30, they changed it again. "I know," Nadia said. "I'm here." Trevor arrived at 7:27, his hair still carrying the damp of a recent shower, wearing the expression of a man who had clearly not been informed about the earlier start time and was recalculating rapidly. At 7:30, Judge Hartwell entered, and Stuckey called the room to attention, and everyone rose, and the woman in the wheelchair at the respondent's table, who had been sitting in this room in the dark for over an hour, who had climbed 14 stairs on her arms, while the elevator sat broken with its yellowing sign, who had been told in 17 different ways by this building and this court that she had not been thought of when it was designed, looked up at the bench with her hands flat on the armrests and her expression unchanged. Hartwell looked at her, and this time what moved behind the judge's eyes was not contempt, but something Nadia had seen before in the faces of commanders who had given orders expecting compliance and encountered the specific inconvenience of someone who had simply decided not to comply. It was the beginning of the understanding that this was not going to go the way it was supposed to go. The morning session opened with Vale's witnesses, and the first one she called was Elliot Crane, the clerk from the window upstairs, who took the stand wearing the wire-rimmed glasses and the expression of a man who has been told what to say and has decided that saying it cleanly is better than thinking about why he's saying it. Vale led him through a description of his interaction with Nadia on the first day, difficult, combative, unwilling to comply with standard procedures, photographed official documents without authorization, and used it to build an argument about temperament, about whether someone who behaved this way toward courthouse staff was the kind of person who should be raising a young child. And the argument had the surface plausibility of anything that stays close enough to the facts while inverting their meaning. Adrian let her finish. Then he stood up and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit D7," and held up a printed document, and the specific quality of silence that followed was the silence of a room that can sense a pivot coming. The email had been sent from Crane's official courthouse account at 4:52 p.m. on the day of the first hearing, addressed to Vale's office with a subject line that left no room for misinterpretation because Crane had been sloppy in the specific way of people who have been protected long enough to stop worrying about being found. Hartwell read it aloud in the flat clinical tone of someone trying to process information that requires a rapid internal adjustment, and the courtroom absorbed each word with the particular attention of people witnessing something shift irrevocably. The email described moving Nadia's hearing time, noted that short notice should create compliance issues, and ended with an offer to help further if needed. Crane looked at Vale. Vale looked at the table. The table offered nothing. Hartwell dismissed Crane from the stand and suspended him from his duties pending review, and her voice was controlled and her manner was decisive, and Nadia watched from her position in the aisle and saw clearly, without doubt, the brief exchange of glances between Hartwell and Vale before the judge spoke a small, quick message, transmitted and received the signal of two people who have just determined that one of them is going to be sacrificed to protect the arrangement. Crane was the offering. The arrangement was still intact. Nadia leaned toward Adrian and said quietly, "She knew about the email before you produced it. Crane was always going to be given up." Adrian looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because I've watched people make those decisions," Nadia said, in rooms where the cost of getting it wrong was considerably higher than this one. Trevor Boland took the witness stand with the performance of a man who has been coached extensively and has practiced sufficiently that the coaching no longer shows on the surface, only in the slight over-precision of his answers, the way each response arrived a half-beat too ready, the way grief and love and concern each appeared on his face at exactly the moments when a script would call for them. He talked about Lily the way a person talks about a possession they miss with genuine feeling, because the missing was real, even if what was missed was not what he claimed, and Vale walked him through it with the expert patience of someone who knows exactly how long to let a witness speak before the humanity becomes too detailed to sustain. Adrian's cross-examination began with small, precise questions, the kind that seem casual until they accumulate. He asked about the bicycle Trevor claimed to have taught Lily to ride. Trevor's answer, delivered with confidence, contained a detail about the color of the bike that contradicted a detail in his own sworn deposition from 2 months earlier, and Adrian noted it without comment and moved forward, and Trevor's certainty shifted by a degree that was almost invisible but was there. Adrian introduced the name of a man Trevor had been connected to a cousin who had appeared in a hospital emergency room with injuries consistent with assault, who had declined to press charges, who had told a mutual acquaintance on record that he was scared, and Vale objected and Hartwell sustained and Adrian moved on, but the room had heard it, and the room was doing the arithmetic. And then Adrian said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call Mrs. Tamika Jordan Lilly's third-grade teacher to address a specific item of testimony." Mrs. Jordan's sensible shoes, honest face. The particular serenity of a person who has spent 21 years in the company of children and has learned what matters and what does not, confirmed that Lily was a bright, engaged, happy student who arrived on time every morning and left without incident every afternoon. And then she said, because Adrian had asked her to tell the court anything Lily had said that she thought was relevant, that 3 weeks ago, during a classroom discussion about people the students admired, Lily had stood up in front of her entire class and said, without hesitation or embarrassment, with the plain and absolute certainty of a child reporting a known fact, "My grandma can't run, but she never lets me fall." The sentence fell into the room like a stone into still water, and the rings it made spread outward in every direction. And Nadia, who had not allowed herself any visible reaction to anything that had been said in this courtroom since the hearing began, looked down at the table for exactly 2 seconds before she looked back up, and in those 2 seconds, she was somewhere else entirely, in a kitchen on Caldwell Street, watching an 8-year-old girl draw a house with too many windows and a wheelchair by the door. Hartwell announced a short recess at 11:50, with the particular efficiency of someone who wants to reach the closing arguments before anything else can happen, moving the morning toward its conclusion with the determined pace of a person who has decided that speed is now her most reliable ally. Nadia wheeled to the corridor, found a quiet alcove near the water fountain, and called Donna Reyes. She laid out everything in 4 minutes and 11 seconds, the schedule changes, the Crane email, the photograph of Hartwell and Vale at the gala 3 years ago. The audio recording from the hallway with Trevor, the ADA violations documented across both days, the motion to recuse that Hartwell had already denied, and Donna listened without interrupting, and Nadia could hear the sound of rapid note-taking on the other end, the specific percussion of someone understanding that what they are receiving is significant. When Nadia finished, Donna was quiet for 3 seconds. "If I publish this," she said, "it will not be a small story. Hartwell Vale. The courthouse itself, this is going to be looked at from every direction." "I know," Nadia said. "Nadia, are you ready for that?" Nadia reached into her breast pocket and felt the folded edge of Lily's drawing the house with the too many windows, the small wheelchair figure at the door drawn by a child who saw her grandmother clearly, and found nothing in what she saw that required explanation or apology. "Publish it," she said. She ended the call and went back inside. He found her in the corridor just before the afternoon session resumed, and he approached the way people approach when they have decided to do something that requires the decision to be made all over again, every step of the way. And he stopped at a respectful distance and said nothing for a moment, and Nadia waited. "Ma'am Stuckey," said, and the quality of his voice was different from anything it had been in the previous 2 days, not commanding, not performing authority, just a man's voice, level and careful. "I want you to know that I saw what happened in this hallway yesterday, with Mr. Boland." A pause. "I filed a report, this morning, on my own. Nobody asked me to." Nadia looked at him, not the assessment she had been doing throughout the hearing, cataloging expressions and micro-movements for tactical use, but actually looking at him the way you look at someone when you are trying to understand what they are made of. "I also contacted IT," he continued, "about the corridor footage from day 1. Someone I know in that department. He thinks there's a version of the file that might still be recoverable." A beat. "I should have done it sooner." Nadia held his gaze for a long moment. This was not redemption in the dramatic sense, not a man transformed in a single morning, not a villain turned hero by the force of someone else's suffering, but something rarer and more honest. A man who had been following orders for so long that he had stopped examining them, who had spent 2 days watching a woman refuse to be diminished, and had recognized in that refusal an obligation he had been avoiding and who had finally quietly chosen differently. Nadia nodded once. Stuckey nodded back and returned to his post. The afternoon session opened with closing arguments, and Vale presented hers with the composed authority of a woman who does not yet know that the ground is moving, covering the familiar territory: stability, active parenting, physical capability, and landing her conclusion with the particular confidence of someone who has won many rooms that looked like this one. Adrian rose, and the room noticed the difference immediately, not in volume or urgency, but in the specific quality of stillness that precedes something, the way the air changes before weather. "Your Honor," he said, "before I address the evidence in this case, I would like to enter into evidence. Exhibit R1, the official service record of Ms. Nadia Okafor obtained from the National Personnel Records Center." He picked up the document and began to read. Not quickly, not for effect, but with the deliberate care of someone reading something that has weight and deserves to be heard at the speed at which it can be absorbed. Service record: United States Army. Name: Nadia Elaine Okafor. Rank at Retirement Colonel. Branch Medical Corps. Total years of service: 23 years, 7 months. He turned a page. Deployments: Operation Enduring Freedom 2013, stationed at Forward Operating Base, Price Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Another page. Commendations: Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, Combat Medical Badge. The room had been quiet before. Now it was a different kind of quiet, the kind where people have stopped thinking about what they were thinking about, and have given all of their attention to a single point. Adrian's voice softened slightly, not for performance, but because the material required it. Combat injury. March 19, 2013. Helmand Province. Colonel Okafor's medical convoy was ambushed by insurgent forces approximately 18 kilometers from Forward Operating Base Price. The lead vehicle was destroyed by an improvised explosive device. Colonel Okafor, serving as the ranking medical officer, immediately moved under ongoing fire to evacuate wounded personnel. She personally carried 4 soldiers to safety. She directed triage for 11 others. She performed emergency surgery on 2 critical patients in the field. In total, 17 soldiers survived the ambush due to her actions. While treating the final wounded soldier, Colonel Okafor was struck by shrapnel from a secondary explosion. The shrapnel severed her spinal cord at the L1 vertebra, resulting in permanent paralysis. She completed the evacuation of all surviving soldiers before allowing treatment for her own injuries. Adrian set the document down. In the corner of the room, Officer Stuckey was looking at his shoes. Trevor Boland's face had gone through several expressions rapidly, and had arrived at something that was not quite shame, but was the texture of a man who has just understood fully and without a way back that he miscalculated badly. Hartwell had begun to arrange her ruling notes when the side door opened. David Ashworth, Assistant Attorney General for the state of South Carolina, walked in with 2 staff members behind him, and the particular bearing of someone who is about to do something irreversible and has made peace with that in advance. And the room rearranged itself around his entrance, the way rooms rearrange around someone carrying official authority rather than merely performing it. Donna Reyes had published her story at 6:12 that morning. By 9 a.m., it had 83,000 views. By 11:30, the Attorney General's office had issued a preliminary statement. By the time Ashworth walked through the door of courtroom B9, the governor had already signed the order. "Your Honor," Ashworth said, and his voice filled the room without effort. "The governor of South Carolina has signed an emergency order suspending these proceedings pending a formal investigation into potential judicial misconduct. The order is effective immediately." He produced the document, official seal, gubernatorial signature, the whole architecture of authority made physical, and extended it toward the bailiff. Stuckey crossed the room and took the document and read it. and something moved through his expression that Nadia had not seen on his face in 2 days. Something that was not quite relief, but was the specific feeling of a person who has been given permission to do the right thing and finds that the permission is mostly what they needed. He walked to the bench and said quietly, "The way you say difficult things to people who are going to resist them. Your Honor, please come with me." Hartwell looked at the room at Ashworth, at Adrian, at Vale, at Trevor, and finally and briefly at the woman in the titanium wheelchair at the respondent's table. And then she stood, straightened her robe, and walked with Stuckey toward the side door, and she did not speak, and she did not look at Nadia again as she passed. She did not need to. They both knew what had happened. 3 days later, the assigned replacement was Judge Bernard Osei, 61 years old, 30 years on the bench. A man whose reputation for fairness had become the kind of reputation that other judges' reputations were measured against. Not because he was lenient or strict, but because he was genuinely interested in the truth, the way some people are genuinely interested in mathematics not as a performance of interest, but as an actual orientation toward a thing they find beautiful and necessary. He allowed the submission of Stuckey's incident report. He admitted the corridor audio recording that Hartwell had suppressed. He requested the IT department's recovered footage, which showed Crane's counter-interaction exactly as Nadia had described it. No physical contact, no aggression, a woman presenting documentation and photographing a stamp. He reviewed the photograph of Hartwell and Vale at the gala, and noted without particular drama that the lack of disclosure had been a significant procedural failure. And then he asked to speak with Lily. The conversation happened in a small conference room down the hall. Lily, a social worker, Judge Osei seated across a low table, so that he was at the child's eye level because he had been doing this for 30 years and knew that children answer different questions depending on how far away the authority feels. Nadia waited in the corridor outside her hands on the wheels of her chair, still and quiet in the way she had been still and quiet throughout everything. The way you are when you have done everything you can do, and now the only thing left is to wait for the world to show you whether it is going to be fair. Through the door she could hear nothing, just the low murmur of a patient man's voice and the higher register of a child's. Later, Judge Osei would note in his ruling that when asked where she wanted to live, Lily Okafor Williams had not said with my grandma and had not said with Trevor, and had not said anything that sounded like a coached answer because no one had coached her, because Nadia had never believed in coaching children to say what you needed them to say rather than what they actually felt. Lily had thought about the question for a moment in the serious way 8-year-olds think about things that matter to them, and then she had said, "I want to go home. The house with the stars on the ceiling. My mom put those stars there." When Osei returned to the bench and called the session to order and began reading his ruling, the room held the particular silence of people who have been through enough to know that outcomes are not guaranteed and that the next sentence could go in any direction. And Nadia sat in the aisle beside the respondent's table with her hands flat on the armrests and her breathing even, and Lily's drawing in her breast pocket, and all 23 years of being someone who does not look away from what is happening, gathered in a single still point. First, the judge read, "The petitioner has demonstrated a pattern of behavior that raises serious concern about the safety of any child in his care. A pattern evidenced by the restraining order filed by the child's mother prior to her death by the incident documented in this courthouse in which he physically assaulted the respondent, and by testimony establishing a history of intimidation toward individuals who cannot or will not comply with his demands. Second, the respondent has demonstrated through her conduct throughout these proceedings, through 23 years of documented military service, through the testimony of every person who has observed her parenting, and through the testimony of the child herself, a quality of character and a depth of commitment that cannot be measured by a 20-minute psychological evaluation or undermined by the inability to run. Third and finally, it is the finding of this court that the best interests of Lily Okafor Williams are served by full and permanent placement with her maternal grandmother. Full custody is granted to Nadia Elaine Okafor, effective immediately. The gavel came down. Nadia's hands tightened on the armrests of her chair, and she closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds she was standing in a field hospital in Helmand Province, and she was standing in Amani's kitchen the morning Lily took her first steps, and she was sitting in this chair in a dark courtroom before sunrise, waiting, because she had learned a very long time ago that the things worth having are worth arriving early for. Then she opened her eyes, and Adrian was beside her, and the room was full of noise, and somewhere across town a little girl was waiting to hear that she could go home. The foster placement was a tidy house in West Ashley with a gray cat and a woman named Patricia Henderson who made Saturday pancakes and had taken good care of Lily for 6 weeks in the way that decent people take care of children who are not theirs, with genuine warmth but also with the awareness that the child belongs somewhere else, is waiting for somewhere else, and that the kindest thing you can do is make the waiting as comfortable as possible without pretending it is not waiting. Nadia arrived at 9:02, 2 minutes late by her own internal clock, which had been set by 2 decades of a standard that most civilians never encounter. And she would note the 2 minutes for the rest of her life, even though no one else would ever know about them. The social worker opened the door and said Lily had been awake since 6, and had asked 3 times if it was time yet, and she had barely finished the sentence when Lily came through the hallway at a speed that bypassed the social worker entirely and hit Nadia in the chest with both arms. Her face buried in her grandmother's shoulder, her grip with the absolute conviction of someone who has been waiting 6 weeks to complete a sentence. "You came," Lily said, her voice muffled, and it was not a statement of relief, but a statement of confirmation. Not, "I can't believe you came, but I knew you would come," the difference between a child whose faith has been rewarded and one who never lost it. "I always come," Nadia said. On the drive back to Caldwell Street, Lily watched the November trees through the window and asked about the leaves and asked about the cardinals and asked in a smaller voice whether Trevor was angry, and Nadia said that Trevor's feelings were something that grown-ups would take care of, and that the only thing Lily needed to be responsible for right now was going home. "Did it hurt?" Lily asked. I saw it on a phone. The lady at the foster house tried to hide it, but I saw." Nadia was quiet for a moment. "I've been hurt worse," she said. "And I'm still here." Lily thought about this with the seriousness that she applied to things that mattered. Then she nodded the way children nod when they have decided to accept an answer because the person who gave it has never given them a reason not to trust them. They pulled onto Caldwell Street, and the familiar geography of the neighborhood arranged itself around the car in the way that familiar places do when you have been away from them. Slightly too vivid, slightly too specific. The particular oak tree, the particular slope of the driveway, the birdbath still in the backyard where it had always been. And Lily was out of the car before it had fully stopped. She ran through the front door and down the hallway and pushed open the door to her room, and then she went very still. The glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling had started to shine in the darkened room, hundreds of them stuck up there 5 years ago by a woman who had stood on a bed beside her daughter and pressed each one to the ceiling, laughing, each one placed without a plan. Just abundance. Just the desire to make the whole ceiling look like a night sky for a child who should always be able to see something beautiful above her when she closed her eyes. "The stars are still here," Lily said in a voice that was barely a voice. Nadia stopped in the doorway. "Of course they are. Mama put them there." A pause. "I miss her, Grandma." "I know, baby. I miss her too." Lily turned and walked across the room and climbed into her grandmother's lap, and they sat together in the doorway of the room that smelled like a child's room, like crayons and clean laundry and the specific warmth of a small person's presence looking up at the stars Imani had put there. And Nadia, who had not cried in a courtroom or a corridor or a car, let herself cry now quietly, briefly, the way you release pressure from something that has been holding too much for too long and has finally been given permission to be just slightly less strong than it has been. "I love you," Grandma Lily said. "More than you know, baby girl," Nadia said. "More than you'll ever know." The weeks that followed moved with the particular pace of institutional aftermath. Not dramatic, not clean, but real. The way real change is always real, incremental, contested, and accompanied by the resistance of structures that were never designed to reform themselves willingly. Judge Dina Hartwell was suspended with pay pending the outcome of the Judicial Conduct Commission's investigation, which Donna Reyes reported would likely take 8 to 12 months, and which multiple legal observers described as more serious in scope than any comparable proceeding in the state in the previous decade. 3 senior courthouse staff members were placed on administrative review. The elevator on the second floor of the building was repaired within 4 days of the story, breaking a fact that Donna noted in a follow-up piece with a single dry sentence. The repair that had been temporary for 18 months was completed in 72 hours once a camera was pointed at the sign. Cassandra Vale faced a state bar investigation into her undisclosed personal relationship with the presiding judge and the potential coordination that had benefited her client throughout the proceedings. 3 of her existing clients terminated their contracts within the first week. Her firm issued a statement describing the relationship as professional rather than personal. The photograph from the gala continued to circulate. Elliot Crane pleaded guilty to perjury in connection with the false affidavit he had submitted through Hartwell's office and received 14 months of supervised probation and a permanent bar from government employment. He had in the end understood that the people who had used him were not going to protect him. Trevor Boland was charged with assault in connection with the hallway incident, an offense that carried potential prison time under South Carolina law when committed on courthouse grounds. His appeal of the custody ruling was filed within 48 hours and denied within 2 weeks. He had been given every resource that money could provide, and it had not been enough because the thing he had been trying to acquire was not something that money could give him and never had been. Donna Reyes continued to report. The investigation she had begun 6 months before Nadia Okafor walked into courtroom B9 expanded into a formal inquiry into the broader pattern of disability discrimination across the county family court structure. 19 documented complaints, 6 cases flagged for potential re-examination. A DOJ Civil Rights Division preliminary inquiry opened before the year was out, and Officer Ray Stuckey found Nadia in the courthouse corridor 3 weeks after the ruling, on a day she had come to file additional documentation for the follow-up proceedings, and he approached the way he had approached the second time, without the badge and authority performance of the first day, just a man walking toward something he had decided he needed to do. "I wanted you to know," he said. "I submitted an internal report about several cases, over the years. Things I saw and didn't say anything about." He paused. "I've been transferred to a different department. That's fair." "Yes," Nadia said. "It is. I don't expect anything from you," he said. I wanted you to know I understand what I did, what I didn't do." Nadia looked at him at the specific kind of tiredness that comes not from effort, but from accountability, from the work of looking clearly at choices you made and finding them wanting, and she recognized it the way veterans recognize certain things in each other without needing it, explained. "You did something when it mattered," she said. "That doesn't erase the rest. But it counts." Stuckey nodded. He walked away down the corridor, and Nadia watched him go, and then she turned and continued toward the filing office because there was still work to do. A month after the ruling, on a morning in December, when the Cardinals were at the birdbath, and Lily was still asleep, and the house smelled like coffee, and the particular quiet of early winter, Nadia opened her email and found 7 messages from addresses she did not recognize. She read the first one, then the second. By the 5th, she had stopped moving. They were from strangers, parents' grandparents, a father in Colombia who had lost custody of his son in 2020, a grandmother in Orangeburg who had been told in a courtroom 3 years ago that her disability made her unfit to raise her granddaughter, a mother who had simply stopped fighting because the system had been too heavy and she had been too alone. Each of them had read Donna's story. Each of them had read about Nadia. Each of them was writing to say that something was happening, a case reopened, a social worker making a call that hadn't been made before, a judge somewhere in the state looking at a file that had been closed. The 7th email from a woman in Greenville said, "I missed 4 years of my daughter's life. She's 11 now. Because of what you started, my case is being looked at again. Last week, for the first time, I was allowed to take her to school. I just wanted you to tell someone who would understand what that means." Nadia read it twice. Then she sat for a long moment in the kitchen with her coffee in the house that was no longer too quiet, listening to the small sounds of a sleeping child 2 rooms away. The particular silence of someone present rather than absent, the silence that is full rather than empty. She picked up the phone and called Adrian Webb. "I need a list," she said when he answered. "Every case connected to Hartwell that hasn't been re-examined yet. And I need Donna Reyes's direct line," Nadia Adrian said, and she could hear the familiar wariness in his voice, the exhaustion of a man who has just come out the other side of something enormous and was hoping reasonably for a brief rest. "You just won a custody case, a significant one. You were in a courtroom for 2 weeks. You climbed a broken staircase on your arms. You were assaulted in a hallway and the governor had to sign an emergency order." "I know," Nadia said. "I was there." A pause. "There are people on that list," she said, "who didn't have what I had. They didn't have a lawyer who believed them. They didn't have a reporter who'd been building a case for 7 months. They didn't have 23 years of training in not backing down, or a service record that could be read aloud in a courtroom, or the specific stubbornness that comes from having survived things considerably worse than a biased judge." A pause of her own. "They just had a wheelchair and a child they loved, and a system that decided that was enough to take the child away." Another silence. Longer this time. "I'll have the list to you by end of day," Adrian said. Nadia ended the call. Through the window, the Cardinals were still at the birdbath, red against the gray morning, going about the business of being alive with their complete and magnificent indifference to difficulty. And down the hall, in the room with the stars on the ceiling, a little girl with a gap-toothed smile and a grandmother's stubbornness in her bones was starting to wake up. 6 months after the ruling in Okafor versus Boland, the South Carolina Judicial Standards Commission published Directive 2025-D-A-12, requiring all family courts in the state to maintain accessible seating in every courtroom, functional alternative routes when primary elevators were out of service, and a streamlined accommodation process that did not require written documentation when a disability was already visually apparent. The directive also mandated annual disability awareness training for all judicial staff, including bailiffs. Nobody named it after Nadia. She hadn't asked anyone to. Of the 9 cases identified for expedited review, 7 were resolved within the year. A father in Colombia was reunited with his son after 4 years. A grandmother in Orangeburg sat in the front row of her granddaughter's school play for the first time. Officer Ray Stuckey attended one of the review hearings no one had asked him to. No one knew he was there, and he sat in the back row without speaking and left before it ended. Cassandra Vale was disbarred in the spring. She did not comment publicly. Every morning at 5:47, Nadia wheels down the ramp on Caldwell Street. The Cardinals come to the birdbath. And every morning from the upstairs window, a child with a gap-toothed smile and stars still glowing on her ceiling taps the glass and waves with both hands, the way she waves when she means it with her whole body, and her grandmother waves back. Not because she is a hero, not because the fight is finished, not because the world has been fixed, but because this is what she fought for. This window, this wave, this ordinary morning that was almost taken from them. And wasn't. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it, because the fight for dignity never ends, and neither do the people who refuse to accept anything less.